Today, I want to debunk a very common way that some try to have Germany win World War II. And it is so amazingly simple. Just don't invade the Soviet Union. This is then usually coupled with Germany should have just focused on getting Britain out first. Today, I will explain why both of these courses of actions don't lead to a German victory as some might imagine. But first, something very important to address: unrealism. German leadership had one goal: the destruction of communism and the conquest of Eastern Europe for Lebensraum. In pursuit of this goal, the war with the West, or at least the war with Britain, was seen as regrettable. After the fall of France, there was still serious hope that Britain would just ally with the Germans, securing the Western Front, ready for the invasion of Russia. The sustained war with Britain distracted from this goal. The conquest of the Balkan distracted from that goal. Everything that Germany did was in pursuit of this goal, and therefore removing this goal means removing a core part of what the ultranationalists were. So, with the unrealism mentioned, what if it happened anyway? And let's run through why just knock Britain out first simply doesn't work. And the proof is extremely simple: Germany tried to. The Battle of Britain wasn't Germany holding back, it was Britain successfully defending themselves. A couple of weeks ago, I made a video on why Operation Sea Lion, the proposed naval invasion of Britain, was doomed from the start. Basically, gaining the air and especially naval supremacy was impossible. And even should Germany land, they could only get a limited amount of soldiers across, while Britain had by this point amassed an army of millions to defend itself. Now, there are other ways to force Britain to surrender, but again, Germany did try these. Germany's air campaign over Britain was comprehensive, but it didn't just fail because Germany decided to focus on major cities rather than air bases and fields. Even if all the airfields in Britain were destroyed, these could be replaced, while British anti-air was causing a lot of damage to German planes, but more importantly, pilots. While Germany may have been able to build more and more planes to keep fighting the British with, in the short term, they just couldn't have trained enough pilots to decisively win the air war in Britain. Now, beyond this, we have the German submarine campaign. Initially, it was actually moderately successful, but again, this is a plan that could only work in the long term. Germany would need to keep such an effective blockade up for years before it would actually collapse the British. This was impossible for two reasons. First, Britain would across the war innovate in an arms race against German submarines, reducing the effectiveness of the German campaign. Perhaps more importantly though, even without joining the war, the American Navy would start help convoy ships across the Atlantic, as well as providing Britain with necessary war and civilian goods. Yes, more German efforts here would hurt Britain tremendously, but especially with America involved, it would not collapse Britain in the short term. But what if we move the goalpost a little bit? Even if Britain doesn't surrender, we might be able to get Germany to turn Europe into a fortress, defended on all sides by water and fortifications like seen across the Atlantic Wall. Would this be a good strategy? Also, not really. Such fortifications take a long time to build, and Germany doesn't have that much time. Even if we assume that Germany creates an unbreakable Atlantic wall, whoops, Italy didn't defend their coastlines properly, and other invasions of areas like Greece and southern France would still occur. Then the final point in this section, some people will say, what if Germany just didn't declare war on the US? Now, this is very plausible, but also a misunderstanding of the situation and the mindset of the German dictator. After Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt would openly position the nation to join the war in Europe as well. The German alliance with Japan, as well as American losses in the Atlantic, will likely be enough for the US to join the war by themselves. Many amongst the German high command shared this view, with the German foreign minister noting, "Great powers do not wait to have war declared on them." It is absolutely possible for Germany to not declare war on America, but it would require another change in mindset for Germany and Roosevelt dragging the US into the war in 1942 is still extremely likely. So by 1942, the German-Allied war wouldn't be that different yet. Germany might invest a bit more in the African front, but fundamental issues of naval control and logistics means that Germany's entire Panzer Corps can't just come to Africa to overrun Egypt. The fight may be closer, but as the Allies launch Operation Torch, liberating North Africa, the Axis powers will still get squeezed on the African front. Now you may be thinking, but why can't Germany just send whatever they have down to Africa, maybe open up a second front in Turkey, and invade Spain to lock down Iberia and capture Gibraltar? Now, some of these might be possible, but there is one important aspect to keep in mind. Across this war, Germany will be walking on a diplomatic and military tightrope. They may have been the ones who have betrayed Stalin in our timeline, but what's to say that Stalin can't ever return the favor in an alternate timeline? With a standing army of 2.5 million, likely to grow to even more as the years progress, Germany can't simply send all of their assets elsewhere. A significant force needs to be on the Eastern Front, because if Germany keeps the border underdefended, they could very suddenly be invaded themselves. Now there is a big field of research dedicated to the question of whether Stalin planned to invade Germany in 1943 or not. Some say yes, some say no, but what we do know is that after the disastrous Winter War, the Soviets realized that massive reforms were needed. They never had the chance to implement these in our timeline, but in this alternate timeline, by around 1943, they'd have 3 years to improve their military. I don't think that Stalin explicitly had a plan to invade Germany in this year, but what I do think is that Stalin is a cold-blooded opportunist. He was in a loose alliance with Germany, but not out of love or loyalty. It was for industrial and scientific progress, and quite simply, money. Being the sole major exporter to a whole continent at war is quite lucrative. But now it's 1943, and the West finally starts making some moves themselves. Like explored before, the Western Front might be too well fortified, but Italy wouldn't be, leading to a new front finally being opened, and the Germans coming in to plug the front line. Allied progress in Italy is terribly slow. Germany is not immediately threatened, but Europe is officially under siege. And this invasion would change the perception of the German-Soviet partnership. Starting as roughly equal, the Soviets now become increasingly powerful within the relationship. Despite controlling a continent, Germany is the one hopelessly reliant on a number of Soviet imports, especially as Allied bombings start weakening German industry. It might start small, with the Soviets simply demanding more and more money for certain important goods, but it could soon expand. The Soviets could very well test their new army by invading Finland again, or at least demanding even further concessions. Should the German situation get more desperate, minor border corrections in Poland might even be demanded, and once Stalin feels that he is truly ready for war, influence over Romania or Bulgaria could be on the table. Though obviously, this is not something that Germany could ever accept. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now, as this was happening, the Soviet-Western dynamic is also radically altered. In our timeline, Stalin was desperate about having the Allies start a new frontline in the West. This is now reversed. As Allied progress in Italy is excruciatingly slow, American leadership starts realizing the true cost of defeating Germany, and they start seriously considering an alliance with the Soviets, with many secret promises made should Stalin join the conflict. Somewhere in 1944, the Allies would still attempt to start a new front. German defenses in the West might have made D-Day impossible, but new fronts can absolutely still be opened in southern France or potentially even Greece. Allied progress would still be extremely slow, but they are challenging German hegemony over Europe. This makes me think that somewhere in 1944, Stalin could very well decide that the time is right. An army of 4 or 5 million is lined up along the Soviet Axis border. The Soviet tank force is immense. Their air force is easily more powerful than the German one after years of losses to the West. Likely, midway through 1944, the Soviets invade Germany. The war can still take a while to finish, but Germany's fate becomes very clear. But before we even discuss this, there is another option. Let's first quickly imagine a world where the Soviets don't ever strike the Germans. Now, another reason why this wouldn't result in a German victory becomes clear. As the nuclear weapon is developed, Japan is still likely the target for the first strike. But if America ramped production up, they would soon have the potential to produce 3 bombs a month. Even if the Soviets don't join the war and Allied progress against Germany is impossibly slow, by late 1945, early 1946, Hamburg, the Rhineland, München, Berlin, Nuremberg, Vienna, or any of a number of other German cities could get struck. While the fanatic lunatics that make up the regime might not care and continue the fight, the loss of factories, of major cities, and of logistic hubs would likely ruin the morale of major army groups, as well as any remaining German allies. This could start the collapse of major fronts, eventually leading to a full surrender. But even if the Germans staunchly continue fighting after this, eventually their military collapse would be guaranteed, even if it takes until 1946. Such a world would be paradise for the Allies, who are free to redraw Europe as they please. The Soviets would keep all the territory they had captured before the war and might try to make use of the opportunity to grab whatever they can in the East. Beyond that though, the West is free to redraw Europe. Most pre-war borders are restored, with mostly minor changes. Poland would be expanded, but be smaller overall. A big issue would be Germany, which isn't divided by the West and the Soviets, and therefore a different solution might be found, potentially dividing Germany into one or more nations. It is even possible that, unlike our timeline, nations like the Dutch expand to weaken Germany further. The Western Bloc in Europe would be bigger, though unlike our timeline, I imagine it would be far less united with things like European partnerships and NATO, while depending on how many nukes on cities were needed, the Western victory could be much more controversial than in our timeline. Now, assuming that the Soviets also don't get involved in Asia, the piece here is completely changed too, with America taking control over the entire formerly Japanese empire, creating a unified Korea, a reformed Japan, and giving Manchuria to the nationalists, quite possibly leading to their victory in the Civil War. Now, on both continents, Soviet influence is far reduced when compared to our timeline, but things aren't all bad. Soviet industry has developed for 5 years longer without any war, while 27 million people have been saved from the conflict. While they do command a lesser empire, the Soviet Union might actually be stronger in this alternate timeline. Now let's go back a bit and discuss the, in my opinion, more likely Soviet intervention into the war. Suddenly, the Soviets are rushing into Poland, but the Germans would be prepared for this invasion. The Balkan, though, would swiftly start to struggle as Germany scrambles to secure their former allies. Regardless, slowly but steadily, the Germans would get pushed back. The war might end later than in our timeline, but the Soviets would have also likely pushed further than in our timeline. Now, the peace deal may actually be quite similar to the one of our timeline, although the Soviets might have secured even more of Europe. Over in Asia, we have two options. Either the Soviets don't have time to get involved and the Japanese surrender to just America, or the Soviets do get involved, leading to a peace deal more like our timeline. Now, should this have happened, the Soviets are not just ruling over a bigger empire, but they are still far more powerful than they were in reality. Especially, the ruined male-to-female balance of our timeline doesn't exist, meaning that Soviet population remains far bigger. More important though is the Soviet industry. It would be so much larger than in our timeline, by not suffering from the war. Soviet industry would decline by about 25% across the war. In the years before, Soviet industry had grown by about 50%. If we assume that a similar growth continues, which is not unreasonable considering the exports to Germany, Soviet industrial capacity by an alternate 1945 could be about 70% higher than it was historically, an extremely significant jump. Does this mean that the Soviets are now stronger than the US? No. American industrial capacity is still unmatched, about 3 times what the Soviets can muster, but as we enter this alternate Cold War, we can expect a far more intense confrontation between the two world superpowers. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing, and if you've enjoyed this video, click on the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.